Working from home has its own unique set of challenges, from finding a spot to create a workspace to getting all of the right equipment. But there's one aspect that's easy to overlook: your home network's security. I'm Jason Cipriani with Jason Perlow, and this week on Jason Squared, we're going to start to dive into a topic about network security. I admit I know next to nothing about it, but Perlo, I know you're well trained and well versed in home network security or even enterprise network security.
Yep.
So, where does someone begin with this?
Well, Jason, when you go to work and you commute to work and you work in an office, there's lots of things that your IT department will do to keep your network from, being penetrated, to make sure everybody has access to the things that they're supposed to have access to, and people, are denied access to the thing that they're not. Stuff that comes in and out of their internet connection
Right.
publicly. Lots of stuff that goes on, to secure systems and make sure all that stuff is locked down if
Yeah, the
necessary, right?
the
Because there's a
annoying
lot of
IT
a
department,
risk
right?
if data gets exposed to the internet, if systems get penetrated, all those kind of things. Now, when you're at home, we've all been working from home for about 9 months now. Many of us have, right? And some of us, you know, we don't give a some people just don't give a lot of thought to locking down their network, or making sure devices that are supposed to talk to each other are the ones that are allowed to talk to each other, and the ones that really shouldn't be talking to each other, shouldn't, right? Some people just leave
Yeah.
their networks wide open. They get internet access from their internet provider, and a box is put in their house, and it's turned on, and nobody ever touches its settings or ever looks at it ever again. It assumed that it works, your Wi-Fi works, your network works, and it's magic, right?
Right. Yeah. Security is never a thought.
Yeah. But the reality is there are some things you probably should look at. You should go into your if you've never ever looked at your wireless Wi-Fi router or your broadband, you should log in and see all the settings and things that you can change to make sure that this stuff is set correctly, right? So let's talk about some of the things that you should look at. Um, One of the things I am going to start looking at as soon as I have one of these devices sent to me is Wi-Fi 6 and the WPA3 security network security protocol, wireless security protocol. Um, Wi-Fi 6, we've talked about it in the past on other shows, is a much faster wireless Wi-Fi technology, but it's also a lot more secure
Yeah.
because it's resistant, to an attacker, a bad guy, who drives around in your neighborhood. We call this war driving. You got a car, and you got a little antenna sitting on your laptop or mobile device, and he's listening to all the traffic that's going on in your neighborhood. He's driving around. Um, Now, one of the things that they do, one of the tricks they do, is that they listen in on the connections between your devices, your laptop and your wireless access point or your router, and he watches, the handshake. You're connecting to that network, and then he's watching the traffic that's going across. Now, then what he can do is he can actually record that that process, and he'll crack your passwords and stuff, right? So
Wow.
that's a problem with the previous generation network security protocols for wireless. It was a really serious problem with what we had was WEP, and some of the older stuff from like 10 years ago and stuff have that. And if you have like older IoT devices and things that use WEP, get rid of them, throw them out, get rid of that garbage. If you got a wireless router you got sitting around, providing extra coverage in your house, and it's WEP, or if you got IoT devices using WEP, throw them in the garbage.
Yeah.
There's
I think the broad protocol now is WPA2, right? So that's what most devices are using now, or at least the default on new wireless routers that are not Wi-Fi 6. But WPA3 is something that's new on Wi-Fi 6 routers.
it's new on Wi-Fi 6 routers, but it was actually introduced a couple of years ago experimentally in the Wi what we call them Wi-Fi 5, but the
Yeah.
the technical term was 802.11 AC, right? A
Yeah.
5 gigahertz AC network. And some of those routers, if you update the firmware, if you've never updated your router's firmware, first of all, yeah, update your router's firmware if you've never updated your firmware. Some of them are automatic to automatically update, firmware, but some of these are manual, and you got to tell it to do that. So, if your router firmware is like a year old or something, yeah, totally you want to update. that stuff, because they're all based on Linux, and they have public, things that have been published about, security flaws and stuff. You want to pass that stuff. But anyways, if you update your firmware, you might be able to get WPA3 on an existing router. Now, all new Wi-Fi 6 access points use WPA3 natively. And like I said, the easiest way to get WPA3 into your network is to buy an access point, especially if you can't change your router, right? And like if it comes from AT&T or if it comes from Fios and you need that, what they call a residential gateway there to provide you internet service, and you don't want to, mess with it, you can get, access points or just, other consumer routers that you can set to bridge mode or whatever, and just plug it right into that thing. And now you've got another Wi-Fi network, right? And you can use a WPA3. Now that WPA3 prevents those guys driving around in your neighborhood from, listening into that conversation and recording it and tracking your network. So that's a really important thing that you can do. To especially, even if you don't have Wi-Fi 6 capabilities in some of your cell phones and stuff, right? I mean, like all the new iPhones have it since 2 years ago.
Sure.
But iOS 14 has WPA3, and so does Android.
Yeah, so that's a good point, though. The devices you connect to also have to support WPA3. I recently turned on a hybrid mode on the Linksys Velop mesh network that I'm currently testing, where it uses WPA2 for devices that don't support WPA3.
Right. Transition mode is what they call it.
Yeah. Yeah. And, it was funny. I was setting up a new laptop that I'm testing as well after I had turned this on, and for the first time I saw a prompt, hey, your Wi-Fi is now more secure, thanks for turning on WPA3. And so the device obviously supports it, as in the network does, and it was kind of reassuring to see a little prompt show up. I would suggest, Perlow, you've recommended checking out the settings for your router or checking for firmware updates. So if our listeners or viewers don't know how to do that, the easiest way to do that is to find out how to do that is just to Google the name and model number of your router or Wi-Fi access point and firmware update or how to access settings. If you use like Nest Wi-Fi, they support WPA3 experimentally, but you also set it up through an app so it's easy to get to the settings and do all of that stuff. But for your own like Comcast gateway and whatnot, search the model number and you should be able to find the instructions that way. That's the easiest way to do it. There's just too many different models and methods for us to go through and tell you exactly how to get there.
Yeah. Now, that being said, nothing beats a wired connection.
Sure.
For security and also network performance. If you have a home office and you have the ability to put a small little switch on your desk and connect that switch, connect all your PCs and printers and other work equipment to it, and then that switch cable to your router, on a port on your router, do that instead of Wi-Fi. If you got one of those MacBooks or Windows laptops that don't have an Ethernet port, by all means, get one of those USB-C Ethernet dongles and the docking station. Those docking stations are especially helpful, for adding extra USB ports, or if you want to split out your video and audio to multiple external monitors and speakers, so you have more screen real estate. Do that, because you'll get wireline speed on a wired Ethernet. The best I can do right now with my with my AC network is around 450 megabits per second on a good day, and I have a gigabit Ethernet connection. So when I'm connected from my Mac directly to my Ethernet, I'm doing 900, 1,000.
And you have extra security there. There's no signal for anyone to pick up. It's hardwired in, and it's a secure connection, or more secure connection than a Wi-Fi connection. Yeah. So what's another aspect of a home network? I've heard of VLANs before, but what exactly is that?
So, this is something that if it's built into, your router or your switch or your Wi-Fi access point, this is so like the analogy I want to give you is like, this is like giving your wireless and your hardwired Ethernet devices their own special highway, right?
Okay.
That no other cars can drive on, right? You got your own special, express lane. Um, so this is done by turning on something called VLAN tagging, okay, in the switch or the router configuration, and creating a special virtual network that only specifically assigned devices can see. So, for example, if you create something called VLAN 100, right, and you put your home office PCs and equipment on that VLAN 100, right, you're going to go into your operating system settings and set, Ethernet settings, VLAN, you put in the word VLAN 100, the same as you put in the router. Nothing else in your home can communicate with them, such as IoT equipment or anything like that. So they'll talk to each other and they'll be able to go out to the internet, but nothing else in that house can talk to them, whether it's wireless or wired, right?
Okay.
So that's good to have. That's an easy thing that you can do if you have that capability.
So your smart home stuff, which there's been a ton of vulnerabilities over the years discovered in random Internet of Things devices. So the smart home stuff, if you have a properly set up VLAN, won't be able to connect to, let's say, your enterprise laptop that has important confidential files on it, and vice versa.
Yep, that's correct.
Okay,
Absolutely.
cool. Do you need any special equipment to set up a VLAN?
No, not necessarily. I mean, there are so the switches. If your main switch that, like, maybe you got like a big 12 or 16 port, or even an 8 port switch sitting in wherever what you would call your communications room, right? The room where your residential gateways drop coming in from your cable modem or your fiber or whatever, and then you got all your stuff that has to connect to that router, right? And maybe you got only like 2 ports or 3 ports on that router, but you need more switch space. So you can get a switch, right? Like an Ethernet
Sure.
switch that is what they call a managed switch, right? That you can it has an Ethernet address. You can set up those VLANs, or it can also be done in your router, depending, or in your Wi-Fi equipment, settings, depending on where it's done. It can be done in any of those places. Um, Another way of segregating the equipment and setting what can and can't talk to each other is something called ACLs, or access control lists. And again, that's something that's in your router. It's a setting and allows you to define the patterns for what we call ingress and egress in and out, to the internet using what we call the MAC address, MAC address,
Sure.
media or media access control. It's like a little. It's like if you look at, like, maybe in the back of a piece of equipment, or if you look in your network settings inside your operating system, like, or on, like, in your smartphone, you can look into settings about and all that. It'll show you that MAC address, and you'll see that these are letters and numbers that are separated by colons, right? And that is the unique, like, name of that piece of equipment, right? Every single piece of equipment that connects to Ethernet or Wi-Fi has that MAC address. They're unique. So that identifies them. So you can say, well, this PC or this piece of equipment with this MAC address can't talk to the internet, or can only do it at certain times or whatever. And these are what we would call filters, or so
Sure.
you can do that in your router configuration for those types of things.
Yeah, and I think Apple recently with iOS 14, actually I don't think, I know, they rolled out a new privacy feature that randomizes your iPhone and your iPad's MAC
Yep.
address, which is not to be confused with Mac as in
Yeah.
Macintosh. And so there may be some issues there with trying to identify Apple devices. You could disable that feature if you have network specific settings that require a static MAC address. But yeah, this all sounds complicated, but in reality, if you sit down and you take the time to investigate what type of switch you have or what type of switch you're going to buy, like a managed switch, like you were just saying, Perlo, uh, really, it's not that difficult to manage on your own, right?
No, it's not that hard. No.
Okay.
And also, there are, some of the newer routers, like Linksys and Netgear, they have apps that you can install on your smartphone,
Yeah.
and they, click point and click, pictures and stuff, and a very typical pattern scenarios that you can configure. They already set it up for you. It's like, point and click, it's done. You don't have to be a network genius to do it. In a similar vein to something like a VLAN or an ACL, in separate access points and sometimes higher end consumer routers, you can create additional SSIDs, right, which is the name of your wireless network to go with these VLANs, and you could even
Yeah.
turn off the SSID. Now, the SSID is the name of your wireless network. So every time that you click on the Wi-Fi browser on your PC or Mac or your Android or your iOS, you pick the network that you're going to connect to, and you see Linksys, ATT, Netgear.
Right.
Those are default SSIDs that come out of the box on that equipment. You should change them. You should
Right.
not use what comes out of the box.
Well, in a lot
And
of
you
the
can
mesh
also turn off the
systems,
broadcast so other people can't see them,
yeah,
right?
right. Yeah, a lot of the mesh systems, the consumer mesh Wi-Fi systems allow you to name or ask you, they force you to name your network before you can even set up the whole system.
Yeah.
So they don't use those default names. But one point you have here is a lot of the consumer devices allow you to create a guest network, but you don't have to use that as a guest network, which is a separate Wi-Fi network in your
Yep.
home for people who come over so they don't have access to devices on your network or information on your network. But another thing you could do is use that to segregate devices as well. You can create that guest network and use that only for your work devices or only for your smart home devices. For a while, I used it only for my Raspberry Pis, which had uh, external access to the internet. I could access them from anywhere through a
Yep.
VPN, and we'll touch on that later on. But so you can use those guest networks for other than people who are visiting your home, which in all likelihood isn't happening right now. And another feature that those apps have as well, and I know it's a point you want to touch on, Perlo, is being able to prioritize bandwidth to a specific device for a set amount of time or permanently. For example, I can prioritize in the Linksys Develop app, I could prioritize my MacBook Pro while we're doing these Zoom calls. So while my children are remote learning and doing Zoom calls, literally right now, there's 4 Zoom calls going on in my house. They're not hogging all the bandwidth, and I'm able to get a good throughput to record this video and podcast.
Yeah, and guys like us, we have, gigabit connections going out to the internet. So, even if it's wide open, most of the time, even if you have a lot of stuff going, you're not necessarily going to run into a bandwidth hogging scenario.
Right.
But, there are a lot of people out there with, 20 megabits still, 100 megabits or less. Or they're using, LTE connections to the internet, whatever it is, depending on where they live. So there's a feature on your existing switches and your routers and access point called QoS. Okay, and you'll see it, labeled in these as QoS, but it's
Okay.
pronounced QoS, right? So it means quality of service. So what that can, so if you're working from home again and your office PC or Mac needs the lion's share of the network bandwidth, for stuff especially like Zoom or any other kind of video chatting, video conferencing system, or you need to do heavy uploads and downloads, and you don't want your kids or whatever other piece of equipment eating up the streaming device or whatever, eating up that bandwidth when you most need it. You can set up QoS, so you can say, oh, okay, this computer with this MAC address, again we get that word again, MAC, right, with this MAC address gets this much bandwidth, right? So if you got a
Yeah.
gigabyte, I want to say, all right, this Zoom, I want to make sure every single time it gets 50 megabits per second or whatever it is, then, or this particular application at all times gets this much traffic chopped up for this big a lane. You can do that, you know?
Yeah, exactly. And in Nest Wi-Fi, you can actually set a time limit too. Prioritize this device for 30 minutes.
Yep.
Prioritize this device for an hour and a half. And there's even settings in the app itself to prioritize online gaming. And they've recently added a setting for video calls. So automatically it will detect on the network
Yes.
if a device has a video call going on, it will prioritize that device automatically. You don't have to do anything. So in these consumer devices, they're trying to make it as easy as possible. So you don't need to hire an IT person like your work office has, the IT department that has all these weird rules that you have to abide by. You don't have to hire someone to do that for your own home. You're able to manage it yourself. So it may be called QoS, it may be called priority device or whatever it is, but
Traffic
definitely,
prioritization or something.
yeah,
And again, if you have an internet provider that gives you a piece of equipment, but we know the residential gateway, or they call it an RG at AT&T. Maybe your RG is a couple of years old, maybe it's 3 or 4 years old, and it doesn't have these features, but maybe the new ones that they now sent to new customers do.
Yeah.
You can probably get them to give you a new one for free. Okay,
Right.
I had
Yeah.
AT&T do that. I had an older version of an Aris RG, and they had just come out with a new one with some new stuff on it. That had a faster processor and other stuff on it. I just had them send me a new one. I sent the old
Yeah.
one back, and they didn't even charge me for it.
Yeah, that's solid
So
advice,
so
Perlow.
look into that as well.
So what if someone wants to build like a firewall or, add a little bit of extra security to their home network? Is that possible for users to do without spending a fortune?
Yeah, totally. So most routers have some sort of firewall built into it.
Yeah.
And also most have some sort of capability like this already turned on. But most of the ones on the market are fairly simplistic, and they use what's referred to as SPI, or stateful packet inspection, because it's much less processor intensive. Whenever you move network traffic, you got a computer chip built into the router that has to look at all this stuff and see what the heck is going on and transit it, right? So but that's not as sophisticated as what your enterprise data center, your work, you're going into work and having an office building might have. Those guys have stuff called UTM, okay, or Unified Threat Management. Now they use a technology that's different than what most consumers have, called deep packet inspection. And that will even block stuff like viruses or phishing attempts going across the line. Now, if you want to use Star Trek, I like to use Star Trek terms because I like to compare everything to Star Trek, right? And I'm an ultra geek, right? So
Trekkie, huh?
I'm a Trekkie. So SPI is like scanning somebody and seeing what the shape of that person is, and maybe figuring out, oh, that's an alien, all right, or maybe they're hot or cold, or whatever.
Sure.
A deep packet inspection is like looking at that network traffic from an atomic or molecular level, right? It's the transporter beam, the bits and bytes level,
Yeah, I was gonna say bits and bytes.
it takes people apart molecule by molecule before sending them from site A to site B, right? Now,
Sure.
and that, oh wow, this person's got like a sickness. This person's got, something's going on with his DNA or something. This allows you to see not just stuff like the behavior of malware on things like a network port, right? And when we say network port, we're not just talking about the physical Ethernet ports on the network. We're talking about sometimes, when you put in, URLs and stuff, you'll see like that colon at the end of a URL, like
Right.
8080 or something like. That's what we call a network port, right? The TCP/IP protocol uses all those numbers at the end of a connection, for a specific type of thing that they're doing, right? But so this is like the actual genetic code of what the bad traffic looks like, and it'll intelligently block things at the source. Now, a firewall with this UTM can cost as cheap as like $100, or as much as $500 to thousands of dollars, depending how fast you need it to be. Because, like I said, it's got to look at every single bit and byte going across and inspect it, right? And that degrades your network performance. So if you got a 100 megabit connection, you can get firewalls that can process your what they call wireline speed with not degrading your performance for around $100. There's the one that you introduced me was the Firewall, the
Firewall.
red.
Right. Yeah, they have Firewall blue, red, and gold. Gold is their premium device. I think it's gigabit speed that it's able to inspect packets, scan for open ports on your network, block ads, block viruses, malware, all of that. It's not the ad blocking portion of it isn't perfect in my experience, but everything else seems to work really well. I still need to do some more testing. I've been waiting until the kids aren't in remote learning because messing with work while they're trying to do all the stuff they're doing is not a fun experience for them, but especially for me. But it also supports VLANs and some of the other stuff we've been talking about as well. It even shows you how much bandwidth a device has been using, so you know if there's something that's on your network that's running all the time that's a data hog, especially with Comcast rolling out their data cap to
Yeah.
the entire country. Stuff like that. So Firewall is one brand. Who else? That's the only one I'm really familiar with as a consumer. Firewall. I know you know of some others.
All the major network names have some sort of UTM product. But some of these things also have annual subscription costs for stuff like the malware signature, because basically they've got virus scanners built into the box. So you can also $500 and up when you start getting into gigabit levels of performance. And how many people need to access this thing at once, right? Now, I mean, if you got like a small business, you got 25 plus 100 users in a building, maybe these things might need to cost $1,000 or more. At home, you might be able to get away with $500 or less, depending on what it is. You can also build these things, using PCs, Raspberry Pis, using open source software. One of them is Endian. There are a few others. You can also buy PC software like Sophos that you can run on a PC that sits between your router and your network. So I mean, you might want to do some research into this. There's a lot of stuff out there depending on how sophisticated and how knowledgeable and what your skill set is for some of these things. But like I said, you can buy a Firewall. It's a box. You plug it in. It takes 10 minutes, 5 minutes to get that thing running, and bang, it just works for a lot.
It's more or less plug and play, which is pretty awesome. You get into the gold, there's a lot more network management. That's for someone who is a little bit more knowledgeable now about networks. But the red and the blue are just, like I said, plug and play, really easy to set up, really easy to use. I think I reviewed the blue and the red, both on ZDNet. So they're great products themselves. The gold actually includes a VPN back to your home network when you're out and about. What exactly is a VPN, Perlow?
So a VPN, again, this is another thing that could be built into your router, built into your PC or Mac operating system, built into your mobile device operating system even. This is what we call a virtual private network. So we talked about VLANs earlier, which segregates devices from talking to each other on your own network before you go out to the internet, right? So this technology is different because it creates a tunnel, right, for that traffic between your device, at the end or originating point or the end point, okay, to wherever it's going on the internet, right? So if your employer, okay, has a VPN endpoint, maybe companies like Cisco and Microsoft make these. There's other companies that make these. They've given you some software that you can run on your PC or your Mac or even your mobile device or your router or your firewall device, right? To connect the things that work in your company's data center or a cloud provider using this, this VPN connection. You click the button, ding, everything's green and you're secure.
Right.
Now, you can also set up VPNs at public endpoints. Okay, using a subscription service, so it makes it much more difficult for your traffic to be snooped on, right? So frequently we see VPNs are used heavily by users in other countries, okay, like China, so they can go to websites like Google and Facebook, because Google and Facebook are blocked by the entire country, right, by these giant public firewalls, right? And it can also be used to bypass restrictions on media consumption by services like Netflix, right? So Netflix, for example, only allows users from certain countries to view certain content. So if you have some movies and shows that can only be seen by people like, say, in England, UK, you can connect to a UK VPN endpoint and play that movie. Which is pretty awesome. And there's other reasons why, if you go out in public and you're using public Wi-Fi access points, you might want to use a VPN, because those things can also be snooped, right?
Yeah, and to touch on a point we just made, if you get the right kind of firewall or device for your home network, some of those, like Firewall Gold, include a VPN back to your home network. So let's say you're traveling in a hotel and you need to access some files back at home. You can connect to that VPN and do that, but it also keeps any traffic inside that hotel's Wi-Fi network on your device from being snooped on, which is a huge security advantage itself as well. I run a VPN on a Raspberry Pi. It's called Pi VPN. It took me maybe 10 minutes to set up, and the longest part of that was it creating the encryption key and going through WireGuard to finish that setup process. So when I leave my home, my phone automatically turns on the VPN. WireGuard has this built into the app. It automatically turns on the VPN when it detects that I am no longer connected to my home network. And then anytime I connect either cellular or to a random Wi-Fi network, I am connected to actually my home network's VPN, so everything I do is secure and cannot be snooped on, which is really easy to do. Raspberry Pis, for someone who is bored, especially during the pandemic, and you're looking for something to do, pick up a couple Raspberry Pis and mess around with them. There is a lot you can do there, especially when it comes to home networking itself. But yeah, VPNs are very helpful. So Perlo, I know we have a ton of home networking stuff left to cover, but I think we're going to have to hold it off for another episode. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, there's a whole bunch of things that we haven't covered that these that are technologies that really your employer or the enterprise, the small business needs to buy because they're much more expensive.
Yeah.
And they're really designed to accommodate dozens or hundreds of thousands of users at a time. But we'll talk about that in an upcoming show.
Yeah, there's messaging, there's mobile device management, there's a whole bunch of other topics that we need to touch on, but we're just out of time. So look for that episode in the coming weeks. We may even have a special guest. We'll just have to wait and see. I'm Jason Cipriani.
And I'm Jason Perlow.
And this is Jason Squared. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. And make sure to check out more of our work at zdnet.com.